Right, so post-lunch, the toughest session, and I get the toughest job, most of which is going to hand it over to Mo, who is going to bring energy back into the conversation. As most of you are aware, let me introduce myself. I am a journalist and a news anchor here based out of New Delhi. Talish is a lawyer, and she also works very closely with educating young girls about life skills, about dealing with sexual harassment, dealing with issues that they face at a very young age, with an organization that's called Girls Got to Know. I probably don't have to really introduce to this audience at least either Mr. Pandit, who's very well known, or Ritu Verma, who's of course with Marriott. And well, Mo Matthews. If you've watched cricket or cricket fans, you'll remember him. I think known for taking 10 wickets in a test in Madras. Mo, I was 5 months old when it happened, so even though I'm a cricket fan, I might have missed it. Fond memories of India?
I think you are the only Indian I've ever talked to that wasn't at the ground. It holds 20, 30,000, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who
were all there, who saw it happen.
I was there, I saw it.
Right, so our conversation was supposed to be about the Me Too movement and dealing with issues revolving around gender and sexual harassment, especially in this industry, and educating young people. And the conversation we've been having leading up to this is not to be quoting statistics, because that becomes a bit boring, but to actually have a conversation about life experiences. If I can just quickly begin with Talish. Talish, for a lot of people from an outsider's perspective, most of the people here will be working in the industry, what should be the communication or the lessons of what a Me Too movement means for you?
Right, so obviously I have not been chosen here for anything except for my looks, and that is an absolutely harassment remark to make. Can I request everyone to actually stand up?
Okay, I presume this includes us.
Oh, something fell off. Right, and can I request you to give the gentleman here on the stage a huge round of applause? And there's a reason for that. I just demonstrated to you two things. One, everyone can have a seat, please. I've just demonstrated to you that power corrupts. If you're in a power position, you can ask anyone to do anything that you like. And basically, sexual harassment at workplace is a power crime. The reason that I asked you to clap was mostly because we as lawyers get to know a lot of bizarre gossip. And one thing that I do know about this field is not a lot of men would like to get on stage to talk about, as we call within inverted commas, a feminist agenda. It takes a certain kind of rare courage to be able to stand up and say, do the right thing. And that's exactly what they are here doing. So when you're talking about sexual harassment at workplace, I'd actually like to just give you a brief as to what is described as sexual harassment at workplace by the law. It basically includes what we call as quid pro quo, which is scratch my back, I scratch your back. You come out for a cup of coffee with me. I'm going to give you a great review. Well, I like you. Let's go check into that nearest hotel. May not apply for the hospitality industry because everyone knows everyone else, but there are a few who have been known to do that. Then there is what is called as unwelcome conduct. Now, that itself becomes very subjective, simply because when you're looking at unwelcomeness is subjective. So I could find something slightly unwelcome. Another person may find it extremely unwelcome, depending on what their background may be. But unwelcomeness is here in law described as something that is the average behavior and a deviation from that. So basically, if you're in the hospitality industry, it means that if you're being asked to follow a dress code, and that dress code may include you wearing makeup, it does not become unwelcome behavior, whereas we as lawyers are expected to turn up without makeup, and somebody asks me to do that as a part of the meeting, I might deem it as unwelcome.
So there's a norm and there's a deviation from the norm,
yes.
And then then free choice should prevail.
Free choice should prevail. And the last, of course, is hostile environment. No one concentrates on that one. Hostility of environment is something that can be created even if it is not.
Explain that. What do you mean by hostile?
It basically means that an environment can be hostile just as when the person subjectively feels that it is hostile. For example, all of us are on WhatsApp group. You will always have that one individual who may insist on posting the latest Bollywood movie songs, saying, look at Katrina Kaif, she looks hot. But eventually, because of the nature of the group and the fact that it might be viewed as being creating some sort of stress for the women in the group, it would actually be hostility of environment.
So the women are unlikely then to partake because of the environment, and they are finding it uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Now, where does it come in terms of the law? In terms of the law, it is quite simple and fairly complicated as well. It says every woman has a right to reach out in case she feels sexually harassed. Now, in terms of the hospitality or the retail or the airline sector, it becomes a huge problem, because when you say any woman, there are women that are employed by an industry or a particular organization, and then there are women who are visiting that particular premises. And certain places have greater footfall than the others. So hospitality and retail have a double quandary, which means that their guests or their customers can actually reach out, and they have a choice to complain about it. But when we really look at the Act actually is the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition, and Redressal. The focus is on prevention. Section 19 of the Act is fairly clear. It says, please follow these steps, otherwise the organization is legally liable. Now, what has happened to organizations that have not followed it? There have been notable number of cases. For example, in terms of the media, it's the Helka. In terms of the non-profit industry, it can be something like the Terry. There are a whole bunch of them that have actually had to shut shop. In the international scenario, you can look at what happened with Uber, you can look at what happened to Harvey Weinstein's company, and that's where the Me Too movement really originates from. So if you're asking about where Me Too is, what I do find in the audience, typically in South Asia, is the fact that we like to think it's the other's problem. It doesn't happen in India. I've in fact even been for a meeting where an HR person of a very reputed company turned around and said, you know, there's the hashtag Me Too that's running around Talish, and somebody even put my name to it.
Right.
And I thought that he thought it was a compliment, that he was figuring in a hashtag and running on Twitter.
And what did Talish say to them then? Say to him rather.
I was in my role as a corporate commercial lawyer, so I just smiled and said, well, good on you, sir.
Yeah, I think you need to Google it a little bit more. Right, but just picking up from what you're talking about, creating what is the hostile environment, which is sometimes very tacit and very difficult to speak out against. Ritu, why don't you share some experiences? Working now in a domain where you're responsible for employees and you're also responsible for a corporate culture.
Yeah. You know, it's something that starts at the induction phase, you know. The most important thing is, if you really want to create a great environment in your organization, it is very important that people have to be educated. So what we try and do is that we have a very robust orientation program where you know, they understand the law. They understand that it's not just about, in terms of hostile, it's not just about the way you know, you want people to perceive, but it's the way the employees perceive it. Because something which may be perceived as just a joke may actually be perceived as a you know, harassment.
Yes.
So there we have a lot of...
And often harassment gets passed off. Oh, I was just joking.
I was joking. Chalta hai wala attitude. That is just okay. You know, and today's generation is different. The generation coming into workforce is different. It is also because we as parents are also, you know, teaching them. Schools are also telling them that this is not chalta hai. It doesn't work. If you're uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. So I think most of us in the hotel industry have always, at one point or the other, and many times have faced this situation. The important thing, I think, is to create a program right from the go when the employee joins at what is acceptable and what is not, and not just leaving at that, but...
Yeah, but how do you do that? Because, you know, if we just took a show of hands here about how many people had experienced hostile environments, a lot of people would be reticent in putting their hand up.
So
you know,
we have something.
Because it's the same
so
industry
what we
that
do, and lot
yes.
of the industry is going towards it, and what we do is something which we call the guarantee of fair treatment, which means, of course, first is the induction and the orientation. Second, it starts from the reference actually. So before we hire, we have a very solid reference check.
Yes.
Then, of course, it goes to induction orientation, and then something we call guarantee of fair treatment, which means that you don't really have to come to me if you have a problem, if you don't trust me. You can do an anonymous complaint. You can do a, you know, we have a phone call, you know, which is recorded. So you can just go and make a call without even naming yourself against a certain individual.
And does it work in practice? Have you seen people using these?
Yes, very much. In fact, we have a policy where people even write to Bill Marriott, you know, even to our CEO there. In the sense, it's also creating that environment of trust, saying that, hey, you know what,
Companies
you can come back.
Yeah,
you can raise the voice. And it's just not once. You have to reinforce it again and again and again.
But how difficult is it to change corporate culture where the first gut reaction for all these years has always been reticent, that let's try to hush it up. There are a couple of cases that were mentioned by Talish, and the first reaction of the organization in those cases were, let's hush it up, including the women who were in the top hierarchy of that organization.
You know, I would say that would happen some years back, but in the recent 10 years that I've seen, I think people have become very vocal about it. And there is no taboo to this anymore, which used to be earlier in India that, you know, oh, if you've been harassed, you know, the blame is on you, right? And that was what used to happen even in families. If you really look at it in India, if something happened, they would like to hush it up.
Well, many places in India that still happens.
Yes,
and breaking that and making, I think, it a topic where we can speak out on is a lot. Rahul Pandit, you know, we were talking before this session. And, you know, you were talking about a systematic approach in recognizing the problem, recognizing whether the law is actually being put into place in companies. What do you think the problem is?
Okay, see, we have to see why is it that we are discussing it today and why is it relevant? Actually, as organizations and society today is going up in its Maslow, in its expectations, this is becoming a critical part for any leadership or any organization and actually for society to evolve up. Because in the world today, if you see the Nordic countries who demonstrate the best practices here, also have the best productivity, the best output, and also a very liberal environment. So before we actually come down to the level of an individual or a company, let's take a nationalistic view. Why is it important? Why are we even discussing it? For the very simple reason that our country's GDP would suffer if we do not have adequate representation of women or other diverse groups in the workforce. So in India, for example, if less than 29% women in the formal sector are employed, this means, hey, we are losing 20% GDP opportunity from there. Now, if we come from that awareness to companies, why is it critical for corporates? For two reasons. First is access to a unique talent pool. Because if we don't have healthy and secure practices, then we cannot access that talent pool. The second thing is that if we don't have enough women in leadership and represented in the companies, we will lose perspective of what our customers want. For example, if in the hotel industry today, we say single women travelers are a critical segment, and if we don't have that thinking mirrored in the company, how will it get done?
Explain mirrored, because there have been cases that, you know, we report in the media where there have been single women travelers who've been turned away from hotels. Simply because it was a stand that the hotel owner wanted to take on his own cultural moral grounds that, oh, I'm sorry, how can you even traveling alone? How do you deal with that kind of problem?
Sure. See, the answer to that is that do you have enough thinking in your corporate bandwidth or corporate structure so that it reflects in policies down? Not only that, because if we don't do that, then we'll always have this disconnect that we keep on speaking. And let's say for our own country, where we say that actually there are two countries, there is India and then there is Bharat. And if India and Bharat have to go together, there has to be consensual thinking on how are we going to lead this forward. So the first step in this framework is awareness. Why is it important for the country? Why is it important for my company? And also for leaders in this room, why is it important for them? Because ignorance of law is no excuse. Because in our hotels, we are responsible not only for our employees and for our vendors, but also for our customers. And it's a criminal liability. So this is a framework of a tripod. The first tripod is awareness. The second tripod is the success of execution. So what does it mean? Like Ritu was saying that at Marriott, they have lots of training programs and communication. Here the first thing is pretty basic, that do you have a policy which is in consonance with the law of the land? Is it something which has been approved by the board? Is it something which is reviewed by the board on an annual basis? And is it something which is reported to the government? This is all laid down in law. After that is that from induction to promotion in an employee's life cycle in a company, is it communicated well? And are people trained and certified on this?
Yes.
And when you look at your leaders going forward, are they coming from this bench which is certified for that?
Okay, that's interesting.
And the third part in this, which is actually the most critical, is that what are organizations doing to ensure it is rejuvenated?
Okay, all right. I think,
the simple step, see, you were saying that how do organizations ensure? In Rejuve, you can do audits, you can benchmark, but the critical thing is that do organizations have enough listening posts inside?
Which I think is crucial. It's because we can come up with the best plans on paper. It's in operation that they often become really difficult to operate. And which is why I asked Ritu if the systems are actually working, whether women were actually using the facilities that were being provided. Greg, why don't you come in on this, or from a person who is not a hotel industrialist or in the industry, what do you make of the Me Too movement as it happened, and the perspective of what it means for women or should mean?
Well, the Me Too movement is a wonderful opportunity to give equal respect in the community, and I mean not only for women, but all members of the community. It's a significant opportunity and milestone. And the reality is, if you think modern man began some 3.5 million years ago, Cro-Magnon man, now the idea was that men were the food gatherer. So off he'd go, and once a week, maybe every other week, he'd come back with a bit of meat. But in the meantime, the girls, the women, cook, sew, make flowers grow. Roots, berries, fire, warmth, shelter. Kept everything going. Now, for some weird reason, and still to this day, the cornerstone of the majority of the modern society that we all live in, women own the family unit. Women run the home. Buy the food, hunt, gather. Very little has changed in that time. And for some strange reason, man has always seemed to dominate, be a little disrespectful to the women, not treat women as an equal. Now, Me Too creates the opportunity where if they stand together, one position I have, and just in the hotel industry, is no different from any industry. Public transport, the cricket community that I work in. One of the jobs I have is with the Australian Cricketers Association. Now, our Memorandum of Understanding has just come through. It's our 4th one, and it creates equal rights for players, male. But up until this Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, women were not our equal. So what us men did and us players decided to do, and I'm very proud of them, we refused to accept the MOU unless our girls, our women were given pathways, were given opportunities. They now have equal rights as the men do. Thank you very much. Now, how we went about that was, let's just say our Memorandum of Understanding, we were earning 10 units. What the men did, they said, think of it as in a factory. There are 100 men working in the factory. We said we will open our door to the girls. We do not want a pay rise. We will absorb our women and our girls into our family and take a hit from them. And the reason we take a hit for them is they are our equals. You cannot survive without women in the community. My wife once said to me, I don't need you. I reckon I can have children without you. I can bring up my children without you. You provide, I carry the child, I deliver the child, I nurture the child, I feed the child, I care for the child much more than you. I'm lucky. I go off to work 24/7. She has the child. Obviously, when I come home, I am looking after my child as well. But she is at the cold front of it all the time. And so our girls now are allowed a doctor when they tour, fly the same as the men do. Pay is not the same, but when their product is considered to be the equal, as in saleability, advertising, etc. I think Wimbledon is the only sport, tennis Wimbledon is the only event tournament where there is equal pay. Now, some men say, well, hang on a minute, they're not playing 5 sets. The standard's not as good. Serena Williams wouldn't beat any of the men in the top 100. Well, that is not what it's about. It's about the entertainment and what they provide to the community is totally different in India, in England, and so there is a leading light for us.
I think that's a fascinating perspective. You know, so what would you, Talish, say to the young women there in this room today? What should they be watching out for? What perspective should they actually think, rather than putting out tweets and Facebook articles and actually changing their work environments and being partakers in that?
Actually, that's a really interesting question, which basically means, is there a one-line answer? No. My advice is twin-folded in that sense. The first is stand up and acknowledge that you've gone through it. And that's what the Me Too movement is about. If you look at it, I see very few women in this room. I've been trying to count that. But this is where the statistics stand. If you're with 10 women, chances are, and if they've been working more than a year and a half, chances are 9.5 of those 10 would have gone through some manner of sexual harassment at workplace or not. Chances also are that 9 of them out of the 9.5 would choose to either brush it aside, say that they do not want to be difficult, and not call out bad behavior, which is my second advice. First, acknowledge it amongst yourself. Second is basically stand up and call out behavior.
But it's easier to say, right? It's easier to say that you should call it out. But oftentimes there are consequences also of calling it out, and the consequences become life-altering, and those are difficult realities to deal with. How do you deal with them?
Well, that's when the organizations come in. So if you look at the law provides for an internal committee.
Yes.
And that internal committee is supposed to be taking in. Those complaints cannot be anonymous. They must be a complaint that has to be put in writing according to the law, and use that. That is one part of it. But the second is also to induct help from other professionals. And I refuse to use the word gender, because I think gender, as has been led by the Supreme Court in the 2013 judgment, gender is a social construct, is something that is recognized as the law of the land. So when we walk in, it is not about us being men or women, it is that the fact that we're professionals.
But let me take that point.
So therefore, it is a good idea to take the help of other professionals and move in as a form of the community. Also, the other thing is, I think there's a great amount of responsibility for women on top to stand up and say this is important.
So that's for the women. What do we tell the men?
Well, what we tell the men is what the UN has led as a movement. It is he for she. If you cannot sit down and respect a person, and I'm using the word person because men also have been sexually harassed. Sometimes they just don't recognize it. The law does not provide them with protection. But there are companies, Nordic companies are more amongst them, who recognize that sexual harassment can be carried out men as well, right?
Yes.
It can be
transgender as well.
Transgender as well, sexual orientations as well, all of that. And therefore, I think it's very important to basically take on board that all of us can go through and recognize the simple fact that, as I demonstrated right at the start, that sexual harassment at workplace is not about love, biology, lust, any of the other things that we'd like to say.
It's about power and control.
It's about power. So when you get the power, use it responsibly. Don't be about power corrupting.
Rituji, same thought. What do we tell the men who are working in the hotel industry in recognizing signs that they consider as acceptable behavior, but which is not?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is in terms of gender sensitization and educating the men as well, not just the women, in terms of the law and what is acceptable. I would like to say that make sure that you don't just brush it off just because he's your friend or your colleague.
Or if you see your friend or colleague and it's patently obvious that a person is behaving in such a manner, and you laugh it off.
You laugh it off, and a dirty joke is acceptable when a woman may be feeling actually embarrassed about it.
Yes.
So I would tell the men that make sure you do that, and I'm sure all of us would have kids, and we want our daughters to go to workplaces which are safe. So first responsibility is towards creating that workplace ourselves. Also, it's no longer really about moral stand. It's really about economics and productivity for companies. There are a lot of studies which are done. One I was just reading about was for Sodexo, where they say that their productivity went up because of a balanced workforce. A balanced workforce is very critical because, as they say, men and women are equal, but they're not identical. The thinking is different. And they diversified thought.
Okay, but when you say that look, it's equal and not identical, the often response of especially big companies in dealing with this is, instead of being gender neutral, become gender segregation, that the women are to do a kind of task because that is considered safer somehow. How do we break beyond those boundaries?
I think we have to still break. I won't say we've broken through those boundaries, but more and more women are taking up anything that
So how do you deal with women in an industry that is open 24 hours? How do you deal with safety issues, security issues, which are genuine issues?
I mean, safety, security is a genuine issue, and we have to create that environment. You know, there is, in terms of the drops, there is a law which states that after certain hours we have to provide drop to our women. So we have to do that. As I said, it's not about moral anymore. It's about productivity. It's about economics for a company. And if we do want, and there are many examples where companies have done better when they have a balanced workforce. So if we want that, you know, if we feel that, you know, and we believe that, you know, that having a balanced workforce will help us in our bottom line, top line, then we have to invest in that.
Okay, that becomes a you know, top-down approach. Greg, come in on this before I get Rahul in. You know, just the practicality of it. Where we want to be gender neutral or in casting for roles in a particular company in employment, and we want to aspire towards that gender balance where it becomes mutually exchangeable, all sorts of roles. But then there are practicalities, and from a bottom-up perspective, what are the practicalities that one should worry about? Safety. Greg, why don't you take that? What simple things are safety in the kind of roles one is performing?
Just to summarise some of the information that we're showing you already, I love what Rahul almost led with, leadership. It takes courage to put your hand up. I'm like, you can bring in legislation in sport. We've seen with certain sides like South Africa, certain countries, they have a racial policy. Now, is that racism where half the team has to be of colour or black and the other of white Caucasian? It's interesting, and just the whole idea of colour and gender. A mate of mine's, Viv Richards, one of the greatest batsmen ever. He's my black brother. Now, today, I was educated doing that with Winnie. A dude will walk up to him today and say that, boof, he'll put one on him. So it's interesting how we're still growing, we're still learning. Leadership absolutely is the key. The tourist group who I work for have more women directors than they do male. In the Australian community, 10% of women sit on boards. India has shown tremendous courage. You've voted a female leader. I can think of Germany, Merkel. Margaret Thatcher was just inspirational when I was in England in the 80s. She took on the coal mine, she took on the unions, and she won. So, as Talish and others, you say, how's it done? One man, one vote. One woman, one vote. One transgender, one vote. Everyone is equal. It takes courage. There will be casualties. But if you stand together and you are united, you will survive. You will get through this moment. And India, think about it. China, India, the most populous countries in the world.
Yes.
China, open your mouth there. I'm not going to say what goes down, but it's a communist country. You jump when the man says to jump. In India, you still have options. Indian women sit on the edge of history. They, as a population, the sheer weight of numbers, can, like the ants, control the insect world, and I'm not drawing a parallel there, but the efficiency, the dynamics of them. And women, if they stand together, if they're united, if they communicate, that's why I love Girls Gotta Know. You know, pick up the phone, make the call, check out the website. It empowers women. It gives you the opportunity. Talk to your girlfriend about it. Say, hey, what do you think? Have you checked out Girls Gotta Know? Wow. I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I had the opportunity to do this. Register,
and
be involved,
it's instinct.
commit.
If it feels like you're being harassed, then the answer is you
Make
probably
the
are.
call.
Don't counter-question yourself.
Because otherwise, you're gonna be copping it for the rest of your life. When is it enough? And the one question, guys, you should ask yourself, and to a lesser extent women, because they have not been empowered enough yet, because they do not have equal rights, every man in this room should ask himself, if that was happening to my woman, to my daughter, to my wife, to my mother, would I be happy about it? No. And so why are you doing it? And there's a reason why they're doing it, which is a naughty reason.
Okay, Rahul, get a different perspective. And I spoke to you about this before we came onto the panel. Share your personal experience. Now, you've seen it from the other side. Share your personal experience. What was it like? What are the cautionary tales to learn from there?
See, one is, I think that all great companies have great processes in there. So first is that the company's processes, you know, especially around the ICC, they have to be solid. The second is that, you know, eventually truth comes out.
Yes.
And third, from a CEO perspective, you know, whenever anything like this would happen in any company, it is to see that there is no dereliction or slowdown in performance. You know that the cultural...
Explain that. So first you're saying processes, that regardless of who it is and what level it is, the process should be respected because the process, just like the law, should be above everything else.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And when you say there's no impact on performance, what does that mean?
See, because what can happen is that any incident like this can take lots of employee bandwidth away. You know, there could be concerns, there could be talks, there could be anxiety. So from a leadership perspective, it is critical that the organization is kept focused on a productive environment, and anything like this is actually used as a cultural stepping stone. You know, in fact, a case study to say how can our processes internally be improved.
Okay. Okay. I think Talish wanted to make a point. Go ahead, Talish.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to what Greg said about Indian women. Actually, statistically, Indian women are roughly about 6% of the world's population. And that becomes a very interesting analogy as to how we are. I think Mr. Pandit also touched upon the fact that we're keeping workforce out. I think what needs to be remembered is that in 1992, the formal sector, the employment levels in both formal and informal sectors were roughly about 47%. Cut to 2018, latest World Bank reports of 2017 are talking about the fact that we have less than 29% women that are a part of it. I think there was a great case that was made by Ritu here about how it adds to diversity, all of this, and here's what I'm going to say. Women get employed in any organization for the same reason that anyone else does, but women are mostly preferred or given a slot because they work twice as hard at about 3/4 the money. And that's not me talking, that's the gender pay gap relatively that is existent in India. And that's the only reason why organizations which are obviously more focused towards profit.
So let me put a different perspective. Ritu ji, now in the hospitality industry, where the global statistics are, forget gender parity, 55% of the global workforce in hospitality is already women. So for a lot of people sitting here wondering, look, the other industries have to deal with it. We've already dealt with it. What's the cautionary tale there?
Actually, we haven't really dealt with it because you can see less women here, right? So if you really look at it, I think we're struggling with the diversity as well. I think most of the organizations' diversity sits around, in the hotel industry, sits around 20%, 21%. In fact, what is happening when you go to catering colleges, today you don't see too many women going into catering colleges anymore. You know, they are going to the retail sector, they are going into a lot of other industries. But
and how is that an HR challenge for you to get to rope in talent into your company and into the industry?
It is a HR challenge, one, of course, because first is to get in the right talent in, and second is to retain. So as you said, unless we don't really create that infrastructure, we don't create that awareness, and we don't create that culture, we will not be able to be a gender diverse.
I just want to touch on another point, and Greg, help us touch into this. That there is a feeling, and it happens in conversations that take place in pretty much every company, especially the men in the company, that this has become a sort of a preachy thing. That attending conferences like this is I'm saying that talking about, oh my God, another feminist thing, oh my God, and somebody's preaching again, another campaign is happening. It's become preachy. For those people who think like that, how do you bust a few myths?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
That this has become sort of a lecture. A feminism has become a lecture for all of us, and we have to suffer through it because we have to be politically correct.
Well, if someone tells you for the rest of your life, everyone, that you walk past 2 + 2 = 5, it will break you down. Some, it will break you down quicker. Others will ignore it for longer. It's the way it is. And the only way you can change the way it is by stepping up, by being held accountable, by having the internal fortitude to say this is wrong. My parents taught me what was right and wrong. I know what's right and wrong. I do not always get it right. I was educated in Australia had a white Australia policy up until 1974, for God's sake. And I was 15 in 1974. I know I look 80, but it was a difficult time trying to change the mentality around it. But with what is going on now with social media, with the enormous amount of platforms that are available to all of us out there, and while it's very dangerous as well, you have these so-and-sos that use it as a tool to hurt and be nasty and horrible to people. It's also an opportunity for people to say, just don't listen to it.
Okay. Yeah, okay, because there's another counter campaign that's going on online. It's called Not All Men.
Yeah, not all
right?
men.
And a lot of people sitting in this room, including all of us, would ascribe to that. That look, you're talking about some other kind of men,
so
and none of us are like that.
Let me just take that at one level, okay? That's about the theology of or the philosophy of patriarchy. You don't need to be a man or a woman. It's an ideology. It's an ideology that tells you that 49% of the world's population is not equal to another 51%. And I'm not being an apologist here, but all that I'm saying is that it stands for equal rights for people, equal rights,
but for all the people who are convinced that this is happening somewhere else by other people, it's not us, it's not our organization.
So they need to recognize that patriarchy can come from all forms, and patriarchy comes in when you are also silent and say, hey, I'm not a part of this process, but you are a part of this process.
Explain.
Did you stand up when you saw somebody being embarrassed? Did you learn the right way? And I'll give you a small example. I could be harassing you if I draw attention onto your personal attributes. But let's take it for the hospitality industry, where you're supposed to be hospitable, so you genuinely pay compliments all the time. And this is how I could say, I could say, Rishab, you're looking good today. That may be misconstrued. Or I could say, Rishab, your shoes are amazing. There's a difference in that. And that's the difference that they need to learn. And if you're not learning that, if you're even forwarding something, then you're a part of that entire, you're a part of this. The second argument that I put forward about not all men is that forget about all these rationals, it doesn't involve me, it doesn't involve, most of the times that I see, and I see that at the leadership level, when it strikes them, it is like lightning. They'd be like, oh, but it was just a comment. Oh, I just meant to be nice.
Or like I said earlier, it's just a joke. Yeah, I was just being hospitable.
Yeah, I was being hospitable. I was just giving her a hug. I was just doing this. It's always just, the word just. The moment the word just comes in, as a lawyer, I'm like, oh, here goes another ignoramus.
So what's the gut reaction? What is that fine line, and how do people who intentionally, through their conscious thought process, don't want to behave in a certain way? I'm talking about the men.
Yeah.
But the culture they've grown up with, what is acceptable, has been different for so long that they think it's normal.
Yeah,
what do we tell them?
We grew up with a culture where we did not know about how to tie our ties, remember? We got to know them when we went to fancy schools. I think just like that, it has to change for you. You just have to realize it's a regime thing. It's not a soft skills training. It's a criminal act. The IPC can throw you behind the Indian Penal Code, actually makes it a criminal liability, which means I can go into a police station today if I felt harassed here and now. The second is, how do men perceive whether they're being harassers or not? Because a lot of the times it's not about me, comes from the fact that you don't recognize how obnoxious you are being. And that doesn't mean you, Rishab, but I'm just generally saying as a part of the literal thing.
I'm really obnoxious on television, I promise you that.
Sorry, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I think if I may complete, I think the test of that is go back into your homes and see a 5-year-old child. Specifically, or a 90-year-old grandmother. If you wouldn't do that to the 5-year-old child or the 90-year-old grandmother, it has no place at the workplace.
Okay, I think that's good point to be made. Yeah, Rahul, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the same thing. To say instead of organizations can create a framework, but for every individual, the realization has to come from within.
Yes.
And a very simple way of saying that is to say, hey, would I say or do this to my daughter? Because otherwise then we are leading two perspectives.
Dual life.
I may be saying, hey, I can say this to Ritu, but at home would I say it to my daughter? So a very simple training thing is, would I make this comment, or would I behave in this fashion with my daughter?
Or would I like it if somebody behaves?
Or would I like it?
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead, then I'll get Ritu. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to pick up that comment and run with it. Guys, I have two sons and a daughter, and I am still amazed to this day. My son is 29. I would talk to him in the womb like he was my equal. I would talk about sex, drugs, rock and roll, life with Sanyo, sing to him, encourage him. Now my daughter comes along. I say exactly the same things to my daughter as I do to my sons. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, life with Sanyo. And 99% of men to this day still say to me, you can't talk to your daughter like that. Why can't I talk to her about sex? Why can't she enjoy sex just as much as my son? Why would I not treat her as an equal? It is somehow ingrained in people, in men, to think, wow, they're somehow inferior to us, and yet they are the cornerstone of the community.
I think that has to be lost. Okay, just quickly, let's go. Ritu, what do you make of this? Because of this sort of a counter culture that says, which is some people call it denial. It's also known as a river in Africa. That look, this is not us. This is not our company. This is somebody else. Some other kind of guys who hang out. This other kind of guys who are in a bar in a fancy hotel like this, who behave in this fashion, not us.
No, I don't think that's what any company should think, because a company is made of all type of people. So I don't think we live in the denial, and I think it's all being about regimental about it. That's what Talish was saying. We have to be regimental about it. It's not. I mean, of course, the policies, processes, everything is there, but we have to be regimental. So if there is anything that comes, any complaint that comes, there has to be a process followed. There has to be
so I have just putting it in there, just to put that in there. So I have a very interesting experience around POSH, or prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. 1997, the Vishaka judgment gets passed. I was just entering uni, so I'd crammed it up for the exams. That's how I found out about it for the first time, and I was like, oh man, somebody comes around and stalks me. At that point in time, by the way, it wasn't a crime, because the IPC described it as offending modesty. And I remember a whole bunch of us from college saying, oh, we're not modest, so we don't get offended about our modesty in that sense. And then you have 2013, and this judgment comes out, and there is the law that comes out around this entire thing, the late Justice Verma, and I quite remember that as a part of an industry organization, I gave an offer saying that I'd train people for free. And that entire room just turned up and stood up and said, but that's not a part of our problem. And today, and about in 2014 in my firm, we formed a little team which said, all right, guys, go out there, spread the message. This is also there. There are the HR professionals in the field, but it is a very legal subject. So do that. And that team, for effectively 1.5 years, I was losing money on them. Today, we are in 2018, and I can tell you that team actually has the highest rate of attrition, because people burn out. They're working 18 hours a day. That's the story that's happening. While we like to say that,
explain why. Because why is there so much work? Is there so much work because a lot more women are speaking up? Is there so much work because a lot more companies are now now taking it seriously?
One is that they start taking it seriously once their top management gets hits. That is a fact. There are the proactive companies anyway had their policies in place, and a lot of it was about lip service. But today, there's a lot more awareness. Once it comes up, you have hashtags like Me Too.
So you're saying there are companies out there who are now taking this seriously and calling in people like you as lawyers to advise them whether they're meeting the requirements or not.
Yeah, because they're seeing their organizations shut down.
I just want to take a different angle, because there'll be a lot of people, Rituji, who are consider this, that and this is psychological. You see the same behavior on the streets. You see the same behavior when you walk down in a highway, and the same behavior that happens even in places where we are visiting in suits and ties, is that the woman is behaving provocatively. All right, she was making signs to me. These kind of attitudes, how do you deal with them in a work environment? The way she dresses, the way she talks, the way she behaves, and this becomes the excuse.
So, the way she dresses is her choice. Of course, there are certain dress codes that we have. For example, in a hotel, they would be given, uniform. But I don't think that becomes an excuse, the way she dresses, for anybody to be making...
It shouldn't be, but for a lot of people give this in their defense, that the woman is being provocative because of the kind of clothes she's coming to an office. How do you deal with that problem?
So the thing is, there's a certain process, the way it is investigated. I mean, the person who's been blamed can give multiple, reasons. And we have to hear both the sides. We definitely, whenever a case comes to us, we don't just start judging. There has to be a typical unbiased approach towards it. And we would do it. But yes, in terms of saying, oh, she was dressed provocatively and hence, I kind of made a pass, is something that we would not really accept.
Okay, Greg, go ahead, yes.
But just to add to that, who the hell has the right to tell a woman how to dress? I mean, if you're going to a specific function or whatever, how dare someone use that as an excuse? She is born equal. She is a free human being. How dare you try to impose yourself on her? Two things. Tell him to piss off and get your brothers and your mates to kick the living daylights out of him next time you see him. Find out where he lives. That's what I say.
Well,
that's actually interesting, because I'll take that up.
I mean that. You kick that sucker. and you kick him where it hurts in the nuts, I bet he won't do it again.
I'm hoping this is not on television, so you can say what you want. Yeah.
And when you're booked in for assault, just call the nearest lawyer. Don't try and handle it yourself. But that's interesting because
and Talish is kindly available. Her number is available on visiting cards out.
Yeah. So, but here's what I would say is that, you know, in terms of where the law of the country is, victim shaming, or what we like to call in our lingo as slut shaming,
is routine.
Yeah.
It's
It
not
is
it's
routine,
not rare.
but
It's
it is
routine.
not acceptable. There have been enough number of cases right now that are either pending or have been decided by the various courts, which have turned around and said that if you looked into the victim's behavior, including at an offside the fact that the woman may have been drunk, then the IC had a problem in terms of blaming the victim, and that is not acceptable.
Okay, I've only got 5-6 minutes left, and a couple of things, practical things. Rahul Pandit, for a lot of people working here who are part of the hotel industry, what do you do with guests? We talked about inside. Guests, male guests who show up in a bar and they're drunk and they're misbehaving. What should the responsibility there be?
It's the responsibility of the establishment that if they are misbehaving, then to escort them out.
And what does that mean? I mean, is there some kind of behavior that needs to be reported, needs to be escalated in a practical manner? Yeah, make a point.
Just very quickly, it's also the responsibility of the hotel to serve alcohol responsibly. So
if you can tell that this person is misbehaving and he's had too many, make a call on this. Practical advice.
And if it's an incident, you know, if it's going to lead to an incident or has led it, it's the responsibility of the establishment to also report it. And if there are people who are like repeat offenders like this, progressive hotel chains and brands would effectively blacklist them.
Okay, yeah. So let me flip it around, because Rituji, there might be a scenario. All right, this is it's a hotel bar. You've got frequent customers, regular customers who come there regularly, and happens to be that they're mostly men, and you have a guest who comes in who's a woman, and they're misbehaving. How do you handle that as staff members?
So if there is an incident that happens in a bar, then the security would, depending on what kind of incident is there, either they would have to complain it to the authorities, or
what's a practical way for handling it? Because, you know, it might be a regular customer, and in a lot of places you have, you know, you don't know who I am, you don't know who my daddy is. How do you deal with these kind of situations? It's a practical thing.
It's a practical thing, but typically, a hotel has been given guidelines to escort the gentleman out.
And I'm sure a lot of people here as hotel people have faced these problems.
Yes.
When it comes
Call
that,
the
you know,
cops or get the security in and get him out of the hotel.
Okay, practical advice. One last thing I need to address, and I'm just going to open it up, Talish, first. Is there a fear or a danger that when teams are being created, especially for, you know, mid-level and senior level managers, or most people sitting here, when teams are being created, and you go, you know, this is the potential for a lot of jhanjat. So now let's create teams just of boys separately and girls separately, because it will avoid the jhanjat. For those who have that back of the mind thought, what do you tell them?
Well, then you're really losing out, because I don't think anyone, there are two things. One is that I've seen in my experience that nobody comes in their job to get into trouble. It's just that nobody put an arm around our boys, so to speak, and tell them that, look, this is not your backyard and don't behave like this. The second is, of course, that if you have teams that are segregated, it is likely that there is more, there is statistical evidence to prove that mixed gender teams tend to have a better output, also greater respect shown to each gender. It's like saying that, you know, if you had single-sex education institutions, it was likely to lead to a more wholesome persona, which was there earlier.
I think what was learned from the Arctic Foundation was that if you bring women to the team, the men start shaving and bathing, which is a good sign. So how much of that understanding, but my question was a bit different, and Rahul help us answer that. Okay, the law gets taken more seriously. And as you mentioned, there is a risk, especially for smaller firms or smaller teams, that in dealing with it becomes a lot more difficult. And a lot more resource has to be delivered dealing with a particular function which is not initially or has not been a core function, maybe it should be. So for people who are saying, now let's avoid this problem altogether by having gender segregated teams, maybe within the same organization, but we'll avoid the problem. How do we address that?
See, the first is, as I said, the awareness to say the moment we start thinking like this, the organization would be economically hit immediately. And the second is the organization would be shorn of a perspective which a diverse team would bring to it. So whether you see it from the short-term impact or the long-term ramifications on the organization, such organizations would actually become ossified. So if we want organizations to be sustainable for themselves, and if we want the country's GDP to be supported so that this entire talent pool actually comes to support the GDP. And at a very personal level, to say, hey, the least which is expected of me is my behavior, which is going to be respectful to everybody. So if we take a national lens, if we take a corporate lens, or if we take a personal lens, this is something very intrinsic and extrinsic. We have spoken to say, is there a framework, you know, where each organization has a policy which is approved by the board and reported?
Yes.
Is there enough communication and training from induction to promotion? And is the organization using a rejuvenating framework where they don't not only benchmark themselves against the best, but also have enough listening force within the organization?
Okay.
And also create, example, a third-party hotline. You know, lots of companies do it, you know, which reassures employees and people to say, I can reach out.
Third party, which means not within the company,
not within the company.
reporting.
Like in my previous organization, we went to one of the big four, and we created a third-party hotline, and we communicated it through and through. And their reporting channels were different.
Yes.
You know, and
so the possibility of influencing those reporting channels
you could not influence
okay, all right.
that.
Greg, you wanted to come in. Go ahead.
I did it. It's literally like the turkey volunteering for Christmas. Now, it's not the ideal result, but as I said earlier, there's going to be a little bit of pain. For the first time in the 159-year history of New South Wales cricket, a woman has finally been voted onto the board. At the tourist group where I work, the chairman, founder of the company, sits next to the driver. It's not just about women, it's not just about men, it's not just about trans, it's about culture.
Okay. We just got a couple of minutes left. Talish, we'll take closing comments, and I think the best closing comments would be to give people some checklist to go home with, that both personal ones and institutional ones. What would it be? What should it be? Because Rahul has spoken about, look at it nationally, look at it institutionally, and look at it at a personal level. What do we take away in form of a mental checklist to watch out for?
Yeah, mental checklist. If you don't want to lose your job and you do not want to be a part of primetime newspapers or other things, just remember, do not behave in a manner that you will not behave with a 5-year-old or a 95-year-old at your home. That's the first. For organizations, just go back and see the number of organizations that have gotten shut down, or the number of founding CEOs that have been asked to leave. Look at Uber, look at BBC, look at a lot of the others. If you don't want that happening to your organization, just ensure that this is neither soft skills nor is it just an HR issue that needs to be taken care of, but mostly the fact that it can cost the life and the sustenance of your organization.
Another bit of practical advice is, then are you saying that this is the line that is being drawn, but what about people who are then considering consensual relationships that might be within a workplace?
It's a bad idea because, again, there are organizations that have already recognized that this is a power crime, and because it's a power crime, in case there is a consensual relationship, unless there is a declaration, you can rest assured.
For people listening, help define that.
Do not, you come to a workplace to work. Please don't get into relationships. Do not imagine, and if you say, we're just friends, imagine if both of you were running for the CEO of the organization, how friendly exactly would you be? So a good idea is
running for Parliament 2019.
Or running for Parliament 2019.
I'll love to hear a few MPs calling each other friends.
So here's the thing, unless you would really like, unless you would like to either lose your job or your organization, if you're running one, if you do not want it to land into one of those things which cost the PR a lot of things, just avoid it and get yourselves in order.
Just on that, sort of a checklist for people leaving us as we end up this conversation, and from HR perspective, when the argument of consensual relationships comes across.
So what I would like to say is that most of the people sitting here are leaders. And I think it's a collective responsibility to ensure that, you know, in terms of the culture and how we drive this in our organizations, it's too important to be left to HR, I feel, and every business leader has to take the ownership of driving that culture. In terms of consensual, I think it's just a no-go. You know, within an organization, you've got reporting relationships. If you're in the same department, it's just a no-go. And most of the companies have defined that. Of course, if you're in different departments, you have nothing to do with, you know, each other's work, and, you know, you don't. And also, there is also nothing that you can share with each other in terms of work, which would lead to some kind of a privacy issue. Well, then you should declare it.
Now, it's not a power play, or there's no conflict of interest. Okay, practical thoughts. So Rahul, Pandit, the same thing. You've given us a detailed checklist, so for practical one for people here to take away.
I'm dying to hear this. I'm none from two so far. I'm in trouble.
Practical checklist is very simple. Do you have the policies in place? Are you aware of that? From an organization perspective, is the organization training, communicating, and certifying its people? And from an individual perspective to say, if you respect yourself, you would really respect the other individual. So if all of us, irrespective of the organization we come from, if we start saying, I respect myself, and how do I respect myself? Because I respect you. If everybody gets that message, that respecting others is not an onus, it's not an obligation, it's a privilege. So if we want to really evolve, you know, supermen and superwomen are not going to be some other generation. It is all of us here. So it's very simple. Respect yourself.
Okay, I'm going to make a public appeal to people to respect journalists. We get trashed about a lot these days. I promise you I don't yell on TV. I promise you. Greg, last thoughts on that.
Well, love is blind. And it does not matter where you are. When I met my wife, I didn't even see, my wife was standing about 10 metres away from me. I somehow floated across to her. I don't even care where she was working and where she wasn't. I understand what you're saying and the issues are. If you do respect yourself and you respect the woman, there will not be a problem. As long as you can segregate work from home. And but we're human, we're not perfect. So I do not concur with what I'm hearing up here, because if anyone tries to tell me that I can't hang out with my woman who I love dearly because she works with me, I'm out that door. Maybe that's the attitude. You think of, in Australia, the police force, for example, much maligned. Now, it's difficult for people that are helping the community to keep it as clean and as healthy and as safe as possible. You go to a party, you go anywhere and you say, what do you do? I'm a cop. Oh, they don't want to know. A big chunk of the community doesn't want to know who you are. But as soon as they're in trouble. So you see a lot of people in certain industries that have to get together because their opportunities outside the workplace are reduced. I heard Talish talking about people get burnt out much earlier these days because they're working 18-hour days. So in the workplace, especially when you're working shift work, it doesn't give you the same amount of opportunities to meet people. Self-respect, respect the person you're with, there won't be any problems. Go to your boss and say, hey, Rahul, I've got some bad news. I love this girl. I love the job. I want you to know this is where we're at. And I'm praying that Rahul's going to go, I've got your back, but these are your responsibilities. Let's see how you go. And if you fail, you're out the door.
Well, fair enough.
The lines of communication must be clear.
All right. I think we've had as engaging a conversation as we could have without keeping it academic, which was what the hope is. So I'm going to thank all of you and toss it over to your next session.
Is this on TV?
It is here.
Oh, no. Rewind. How about these girls, guys? How much do we love our women?
I think big
Thank you, Rishab.
And as a good journalist, I can clap for myself.